cover. I'm Snehesh Alex Philip. Today I have a very interesting book with me. The book that I'm talking about is written by a senior advocate practicing at the Supreme Court, Mr. Aditya Sondhi. Now, this book is interesting because this book talks about both India and Pakistan, not just through the realm of politics, but also how the militaries or the army of the two countries have behaved since the independence. So, welcome to the print, Mr. Sondhi.
Thank you very much.
So, as viewers, I was mentioning, this book pulls apart the military and the democracy in India and Pakistan. What this book essentially does is that this book looks at the civil military relationship and how it has evolved in the subcontinent. I read through this book, wonderful book. How did this idea of this book come to you? You're a lawyer.
Sneh, this to begin with was the research for my PhD thesis. And I was quite clear when I was doing my PhD that I didn't really want to do it in the law because I wanted to explore some academic research outside of the law. And I have had a long standing interest in military history, and I thought a topic like this will tie in nicely with the idea of the growth of democracy, the role of institutions in young democracies, and also take a hard look at our immediate neighbor and ourselves. So really, that was the genesis of it.
Both countries got independence one day apart, right? And both countries had civilian leadership. But then things changed in Pakistan completely. We now live we now have a country in Pakistan where the army selects the government that it wants, the civilian government that it wants, right? So, in your sense, why did these both countries go on a different trajectory completely when it comes to the military?
Yeah. I think the predominant reason, according to me, was the fact that in the early years of both these countries, we had in India a distinct advantage of having tall, diverse civilian leaders. And many of them came from a strong background, not only in terms of having taken part in the freedom struggle, but also an exposure to international politics. Many of them, like Pandit Nehru or Dr. Ambedkar, they were in fact lawyers by profession. And as a result, we hit the ground running. We were able to quickly get our constituent assembly in place, get a constitution drafted, and take it from there. If you contrast this with Pakistan, there was really nobody other than Jinnah. And Jinnah himself, as you know, he was a fine lawyer by all accounts, but he had no he never really dirtied his fingernails in politics or the freedom movement as such. And that said, he was in many ways a loner because he didn't have the advantage of a strong party system or the sort of colleagues that the leadership in India had. And he passed soon after independence, as you know. And as a result, there was this vacuum in Pakistan where governance was really not being administered under a constitution. It was a continuation of the Government of India Act. It was really the executive or the bureaucracy that was running the show. Coupled with the fact that Pakistan at that point, and probably still, was a very feudal state. So the real power centers were with the wealthy land owning, farm owning communities in Pakistan. And all of this, quickly led to chaos. There were sectarian riots, and the leadership at the time didn't even feel confident enough to depend on the police forces to quell this violence and uncertainty. And as a result, the army was brought in. And once the army was brought in, it had a spiraling effect. Number one, the citizenry in Pakistan felt that the army was the real savior for the country because they were the only institution doing its job. And secondly, the army also got this sense of, overconfidence or superiority that it was the sole institution that could rescue Pakistan and set the tone for it. It had tasted power. And as a result, the formation of the constitution in Pakistan took years. It
Yeah,
began
exactly.
in yeah, it began in 1956. Then there was another constitution in 63. It was kept suspended for a while, and really the constitution in Pakistan is the 1973 one, which
Yeah.
is more than 25 years after independence. By which time the damage was done because the army was already inside the real politic of Pakistan.
That's interesting. Compared to what was happening in India at that time, as you rightly mentioned, Pakistan's constitution took time. They only had one tall leader, Jinnah, who passed away very quickly in 1948. But in India, you had multiple leaders, right? And you had Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru as the prime minister. You had Jawaharlal Nehru as the prime minister. But then, Nehru did not really trust the military per se. In hindsight, while we talk about other things about his defense minister and all, in your hindsight, did that really help India to stay away from the course that Pakistan really undertook?
I don't know if that helped. I think, in a way, we dodged a bullet because if you look at the early civil military relations that we had in India, you're right. And this is on the record that Prime Minister Nehru was quite skeptical of the military for multiple reasons, including the fact that in neighboring Pakistan there was already a coup in 1956 when Ayub Khan had assumed power. But this uncertainty also came from the fact that, not just Pandit Nehru, but a lot of people around him felt that the Indian army was a remnant of the British regime. It did not participate itself in the freedom movement. It was not truly Indian in some ways. And there was also a disquiet with the personalities that were there. And as you know, that was the crucial phase. The fallout that General Thimaya had with Krishna Menon is a classic case study of how civil military relations can really go down south. And that sort of breakdown in Pakistan would have meant an overthrow of the civilian government. So I would say credit must be given to the Indian officers, especially the senior generals, who many times expressed their disagreement with the political leadership but never took on a political avatar. And look, these disagreements were not just personality ego issues. The entire issue with the incursion of China leading up to the 1962 war, General Thimaya and senior officers were crying themselves hoarse, saying that you don't focus only on Pakistan, you must look at what's happening with China.
Yeah.
And that advice was just not heeded. And that, as a result, actually took us into a war that we could have avoided, or certainly a war that we could have done better in.
Yeah.
And that really, Sneh, takes me, to the instances in Indian history where the military was hard done by. And in similar circumstances in Pakistan, the results would have been astoundingly different.
You mentioned about the fact that about military leaders. At that time, they came from the British legacy. For example, let's talk about General Karyappa, right? There was a feeling Nehru didn't really like him much because he was very outspoken, right? And he was someone. Did he have political ambitions then? As the chief, was Nehru right in doubting, because eventually in 1971 General Karyappa did fight the Lok Sabha elections as an independent candidate.
So, this piece of information of him having fought the election, I have actually not been able to corroborate, to be honest. There is a grapevine that he contested, but I have not been able to confirm it. But to answer your question, did he have a political avatar? Literally, no. But if you look at my book, I refer to parts where in the early days, even before the Constituent Assembly was formed, we were literally just about born as a young country. General Karyappa had actually proposed that there be an army command, right? That there
Yeah.
be an active role for the army in the governance of the country. And that was shot down, right? So there were, interestingly and very openly, proposals in the early part of our history where even the military command felt that there was a role for the army to serve and to govern alongside the civilian leadership. But that was, at least in India, very quickly it was poo-pooed and done away with. And thereafter, of course, this discomfort or the distrust that you mentioned. Look, the senior brass of the Indian armed forces in those days, which is basically the army and the air force, the navy came later, were really, a certain elite strata of society. They were folks who went to public schools, they went to RIMC, they went to Sandhurst, and they also came, to quotes from my book, from politically inept families or inert families. I'm sorry, not inept, inert families. And the government was looking for officers who really didn't have a political bent of mind. So all of that tells you that the lines, at least in India, were very, very clearly drawn. That the army would actually, in a way, have to prove itself. Its role was really that of defense and no more. But again, to the credit of the forces, as I argue, the forces created that space in the early part of our history to let democracy work.
So it's that also because unlike in Pakistan where the chiefs or the army thought of themselves as this great power which can only run the country, in India you had the civilian leadership trying to undermine. Now this is what one would say, undermine the military leadership. And you also had military leaders like General Call, the BM Call, who also was very keen to, as one would say, Maska Maro the government, right? The pliant generals. Did those pliant generals come in very early into the Indian military history?
So, from whatever I've studied, the pliant generals were an exception at that point, and they were called out by their own colleagues very often. If you see the open sort of confrontation that the the commanding officers, the generals had amongst themselves, it speaks for itself. And a lot of writing from retired officers of that period, they don't really mince their words about officers who they thought were being, like you said, either sycophants or cozying up uh, to the army and to the government. And look, I must say here, yes, the government to an extent did its part to, I won't use the word discredit, but certainly to try and discount the role of the military. But the military itself knew that it has no place, right, in politics, and that was for two reasons. One is, of course, the tradition of officers and gentlemen, which is to keep away from politics, right? The other was the fact that they were never really drawn into politics like in Pakistan. If you look at the composition of the senior officers in Pakistan at the time, many of them came from the same institutions that I mentioned. But the
Yeah.
difference is that there they tasted power early, and they were also in a chaotic state where really the governance and I dare say the existence of Pakistan was up in the air, and it needed someone to stem this. And it so happened that the army fit that bill. And from there on, once, if you study the history of any young democracy, once the army gets its foot in the door, it's not going to get out, right? And that is for greater reasons. Those are reasons of not just power and status, but they're economic reasons. You begin to gain financially in terms of land and uh, appointments and perks and housing. And there's a lot of Aisha Siddiqa, the word she framed, milbus, military and business. It almost becomes a business interest.
When I was posted to Pakistan, I was very surprised to learn, and that's when I came to know and saw it myself, that the Pakistani army is like a corporate entity, from running banks to making cement and
Yeah.
even conflicts, cereals. The Pakistani army was involved in every single side of the business, and property being a big, booming business. Building apartments and houses for the general public, for the rich. Uh, while we talk about politicians, the fact that there was a mistrust among politicians, and politicians ensured that the army stayed within its side of its role. Do you also think that bureaucracy also had to play? The fact that India had a very strong bureaucracy. For example, your book mentions an incident way back when General Sundarji, made some unsavory comments regarding the political leadership, and General Sundarji was like, when I look back, for me he's one of the most transformative generals that the army had. But then he also made those comments, and then cabinet secretary had to put him down. Do you think the bureaucracy also had a role to play?
Most certainly, I think the bureaucracy in India, in some ways, operated as a sort of a buffer between the military and the political leadership. Now, look, this can cut both ways. In
Yeah,
one way, what it does is it insulates the army from direct political interference, right? And that's the debate today, that the bureaucracy is holding back and possibly the political establishment is imposing itself more on institutions, especially the military. And to, in a way, insulate the armed forces, the bureaucracy played an important role. But on the flip side, what the bureaucracy also did was, in a way, cut off the military from the leadership. And as a result, there were misunderstandings galore. And how often have we heard about, officers and even soldiers complaining about red tape and
yeah,
complete insensitivity when it comes to dealing with military matters? And you mentioned General Sundarji. He saw crucial phases in our history, right? The Blue Star phase, leading to the IPKF, both of which were actually instances where the army was drawn into conflict areas without clarity of purpose, right? And that perhaps explains, I don't know if it justifies, but it explains his outbursts as a general. He was also a very outspoken man. And of course, he was practically admonished by the cabinet
yeah,
secretary at the time. But the fact is, these were volatile times, right? And these instances, I mean, Blue Star was essentially an internal operation and a highly delicate one. So to draw in the army, and as you know, it was commanded by a Sikh officer,
yeah,
and there were several Sikh officers and soldiers involved in the operation, but it was a very, very delicate socio-religious experiment which could have gone anyway, right? It's again,
yeah,
I say, to the credit of the army that they took it on the chin and performed professionally. There were protests within the Sikh regiment, Sikh officers in particular, about what they were being drawn into, but ultimately they acquitted themselves. They did the job. And IPKF, if you'll permit me a minute, that was such a confusing assignment for the army, because you were told in the one breath that it was a peacekeeping force, but at the same time you were taking on extremely well trained guerrilla LTT fighters in very, very difficult,
overtrained by a sister agency only.
which also might be true.
Huh.
But you see, you're right there. You're now drawing in different, parts of your governance. After all, institutions are part of our larger governance, right? So you're now drawing in institutions and bodies with a very confusing and a differing mandate, and this sort of thing in Pakistan would never be brooked. If the army was asked to fight the equivalent of the IPKF battle in Sri Lanka, or to undertake something as sensitive as Blue Star involving their own people, I'm pretty sure the government would be shown the door the next day.
True. So, in India's history, among the long military history, there have been two instances where the army or the military and the civilian government has really clashed. And in both instances, I think the civilian government managed to pull the rug underneath the feet of the army. For example, one way back in when General Thimaya resigned, right? And eventually he did. take back his resignation because of the Prime Minister Nehru, who had promised him certain things, and then the Prime Minister Nehru really stabbed him back in the Parliament, right? And then was in 1998, when the government of that day sacked the Chief of Naval Staff, Admiral Vishnu Bhagat.
That's right.
Why did that sacking take place, and what is what was this a it was a counter coup by the civilian leadership, or what was it?
If you read Admiral Bhagwat's book on the subject, and of course he's coming from a
He's
place
coming
of
from a point of extreme hurt and of him
betrayal,
being,
really.
yeah, betrayal.
But if we discount the emotion, a lot of those facts are quite startling, right? The manner, and he did, though, by the way, contest his removal, which is a
Yeah, he
very
went
rare
to a court
instance.
and all. He eventually lost it.
He lost in court. I believe his daughter represented him in court, um, which again is actually an emotional decision, because if you're fighting a case in court, I would tell you as a lawyer, you would never really fight a case for your own family. It clouds your objectivity. But keeping that apart, if you read the book, he makes some very startling allegations, including the fact that it was, as you said, practically if not a counter coup, a coup mitigating measure, as it were, by the government to appoint a new chief of naval staff. He even goes to the extent of saying, the naval staff was flown in a raw helicopter. I think that's one of
Yeah,
the statement he says. It's there in my chapter,
yeah,
raw. And it was very clear that sort of thing could have actually been ironed out behind closed doors. It was really a difference of opinion and an ego battle, from what I understand, between him and the defense minister at the time, who I believe was George Fernandez, if I'm not
yeah, yeah.
forgetting. And for it to have reached such a head, I think reflects poorly in some ways on both sides. And why do we not have mechanisms then to mediate these sort of differences, right? Even with General Timaya, part of the problem was the fact that the opinion of the army was not being taken seriously, both in matters of combat, as I mentioned, relating to China, and also relating to matters of
Promotions.
promotion, right? And that was given a cold shoulder. But a lot of it also was really a personal ego battle. There were too many alpha males, in a way, involved, right? Krishna Menon, as you know, very, very strong personality, brilliant mind, but short tempered and did as he pleased. The Prime Minister himself, a strong personality. The General Timaya himself, a tall leader who brooked no nonsense and was loved by his troops. Now, a lot of this also was a personality issue. And I think in all of this, um, you know, the embarrassment to both sides could have been stemmed if there was a more statesman-like treatment of the issue. And that
True.
unfortunately didn't happen. I think that is a lesson for us to learn from our civil military relations. As much as we credit the fact that our military has stayed detached and we defer to civilian constitutional democratic governance, there is certainly a case to be made for, if not a tribunal, but at least a mediation body or a committee where a lot of this can be resolved. And as you know, some of these differences were resolved in 1971. It's not that the General Manekshaw, later Field Marshal, was on the same page as the government. There were
Yeah.
differences of opinion, but I suppose to the credit of the individuals concerned, then they were in a position to iron them out, listen to each other, speak their mind freely, in larger national interest. Of course, that was a pressing wartime situation where I suppose the role and the scope for egos and so on is far less and should be less. But I think there is a case for some course correction by creating an institutional solution here.
So, one complaint that I have from you with this book is the fact that this book just stops at a crucial juncture in India, which is 2014. Now, especially in context of the military and politics per se, because there are a lot of allegations, especially when General Bipin Rawat was the army chief, and he later became the CDS, God bless his soul, that there is a larger politicization of the military. What would you say to that? Do you see this as something which is a developing trend? And if it is a developing trend where you see the military playing a larger, or the politics using the military for its own goal, do you think it's a healthy trend?
In fact, Sneh, there is a chapter on this phase 2008 and onwards, but you're right, it's not as detailed a chapter as the rest. But in that chapter, I do look exactly at what you have mentioned, which is the creation of the CDS, which was in spirit actually a big step forward to repair civil military relations and try and have an office that does exactly what I was previously referring to, try and bring all three armed services and the ministries and the government onto the same page. But as it's worked, and you will see a reference to General Rawat as being, described as a super general, super bureaucrat, and that description I think comes from one of his former colleagues, and it is seen, and there is a lot of reportage in the public domain about how he actually took on a slightly political avatar himself. He made comments in Kashmir which I don't remember other generals having ever made, and he also discounted the role of the air force in a way, something the
Yeah.
air force didn't like. The Agniveer scheme also more or less came about around the same time. And if you have heard, I think General Narvane's book, which is now on the back burner, actually says that the army was not completely in the know of Agniveer, right? So this phase is crucial. I don't know if we can say the relations are more healthy. Being closer to the government, speaking the government's language doesn't mean that's healthy for civil military relations. That, according to me, is actually unhealthy because it's bringing the military willy nilly into the political space. Now, how that pans out, who has what ambitions, etc., are completely different things. I think with the checks and balances we have in our country, we have a constitutional form of government, we have the Supreme Court in place, and we have a tradition in the armed services to really do no wrong when it comes to politics. This may go nowhere, but perception is also a huge matter. And I'm sure you've seen writings by General Vambatkere, Admiral Arun Prakash, General Panag. These are all very seasoned and well respected senior officers. And all of them are actually calling this out.
Absolutely, and only time will tell where this really is headed. But I strongly feel that, as you rightly mentioned, India has a rich history of rich military history and traditions that is followed. So I'm not really sure whether there would be politicization of the military per se. I think there are lots of checks and balances in place. But thank you so much, Aditya Sodhi and Penguin, for writing this book. Viewers, as I said, if you want to get into a short, quick history into how the militaries of both countries have really grown and why they have taken the different course, do go ahead and get this book. Thank you so much, Aditya.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed chatting with you, Sneh.